Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Travis Heath, and this is the Therapist Confidential podcast. And today I am joined by Dr. Jason Buckles. I'm really excited about this episode because we get to talk about, I think, one of the most controversial issues in psychology, psychiatry, therapy, which is the DSM and diagnosis. Everybody seems to have an opinion on this. They vary widely, and I'm hopeful that we can kind of enter into that debate today, and hopefully we can both learn something through the conversation about psychiatric diagnosis in the DSM. Dr. Buckles, welcome to the show. Would you mind telling the people a little bit about yourself?
I'm Jason Buckles. I live in New Mexico. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, have been for about 25 years. My doctorate's in special education. So my current work involves mostly complex consultation clinics for folks with intellectual disability and concurrent mental health concerns, sexuality, sexual risk, that type of thing. I'm a consultant for the Department of Health here. But yeah, my journey began quite some time ago, and I guess, just kind of growing up as a teenager, I recall, hanging out at the coffee shop. Maybe there was a party going on that night that we were supposed to go to, and, kind of the most troubled person in like a 5-mile radius would find me and start talking to me, and we would just talk, and I would skip going to the party because I thought it was super interesting. And that kind of just continued. I was a bartender for a while, and that's kind of like a pseudo therapist or sometimes the real therapist at points. And I was like, you know what, I should get like paid for this. I ended up going to NYU for an undergraduate in psychology and working at Bellevue in psych emergency and up on the wards for a few years, kind of doing the quick triage assessments in the psych emergency and some research projects on diagnosis, and then really like jumped in the deep end at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, where I got hired to do structured clinical interviews for a huge research project on how the presence of substance use may affect psychiatric presentation and diagnosis, and that conundrum we face, like, is this the substance or is this quote unquote a clean depression or something like that. So we were using a tool called the Prism, the psychiatric research interview for DSM-4, it was at the time, for substance use and mental disorders. So did hundreds of these structured interviews where it was like this 3-hour long, basically choose your own adventure style. Have you ever encountered 2 weeks or more where your mood was so low that X, Y, and Z? If they say yes, you flip to page 32 and go through each of those. So I was having like DSM dreams because you just go through every psychiatric category. So did that for several years, and it became kind of depersonalized to me because we'd write these reports where it was like subject is a 32-year-old, blah blah blah, and really take the person out of it, and that bugged me. So I was like, I want to do therapy, not research, and that's when I moved to New Mexico and got my master's and worked for an amazing community mental health agency in downtown Albuquerque, the Counseling and Psychotherapy Institute, which is sadly no more. Dr. Ken Wells, who I'm sure I'll quote here over the course of the hour. So from there, yeah, I got into the disability field. I had worked as a direct support staff, and to me, it was like people who've been twice or three times marginalized or ignored, folks with intellectual disability, autism, various genetic conditions who then have overlaid mental health concerns. And it was shocking the lack of attention to that. So over the last 20 years of working in this system, we've really built a robust, multi-pronged program to at least, provide some resources for that. So yeah, it just became my passion. I taught DSM, oh goodness, for probably 17 years at New Mexico Highlands University in the master's program, and then integrated a lot of DSM considerations or psychiatric diagnostic considerations when I was teaching in the special education department at the University of New Mexico. So that is the tendrils of all of that. But I do need to say, like, one of my main influences just in my practice and how we go about working with people and community was the Grateful Dead. That's been a part of my life for since I was a teenager, and that really taught me a lot about how does a community work when there's a lot of different things going on. That dance that happens, and the real humanity of that traveling circus that we were all a part of back then.
Oh boy, you said so much. It's really interesting to me. I have to start with the Grateful Dead.
Yeah,
Granted,
let's do that.
there's a stereotype about psychologists in here somewhere and mental health professionals. There's also maybe a
Sure.
stereotype about fans of the Grateful Dead. I don't know, but if I was doing a podcast with someone I don't know, and I don't know you, I'm just coming into knowing you, I would not imagine that the person would, and their specialty is the DSM, mind you, that they
Yep.
would say, "Hey, I took great influence from the Grateful Dead." Like, you seem to be breaking free of some stereotypes there. Like, I would expect, maybe some dude in a suit who's speaking in clinicalese. And so first I'm wondering about like this. I don't actually think it's a contradiction, but it's like a seeming contradiction. And I'm wondering if you could speak some, one, how the Grateful Dead influenced you more, and two, how maybe you're not the guy we would expect to see who's the expert on the DSM.
Right, it is odd. I'm always shocked when I get to keep teaching, because I do have a sideways take sometimes. And like, they just keep letting me do it, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I kinda say what I want. And I was trained, like, really with, a very high degree of intensity at NYU and the New York State Psych Institute, and then through, UNM. So, it was kind of that dichotomy, right? But at the same time, jumping on Grateful Dead tour whenever I could, and still do, and with all the iterations. And to me, it's such a diverse community that we'd see, and it policed itself, it healed itself. If somebody was having a hard time, it was we got this. The folks at RockMed, I remember them back in the day. They were a bunch of deadheads who were medical professionals and psychologists, and if somebody was having a hard time for whatever reason, certainly, I would think psychedelics were part of that. It wasn't, "Hey, let's get the EMTs." It was like, "No, we have a safe space for you. We know what we're doing." And that really influenced me of we can do this ourselves, right? That we can create functional communities. It's a little bit of anarchy, the self-governing. And then you have these incredible lyrics that just continue to hit you and remind you of this, the path of life and the loss and chaos and love that can occur throughout that. So it's kind of just been the soundtrack. And to me, it does speak to like a functional way of being together and taking care of each other.
So am I right in thinking that you've come to think of healing happening in community, or at least largely in community?
Largely in community, absolutely. I mean, I think certainly there's a lot of individual work and insight that's done, but what is that without it being shared, without it being informed by relationship and people who see you through your ups and downs and ins and outs, and wielding kind of these tools that we do professionally? How do we humanize those? How do we make them better in our day-to-day practice?
Okay. I want to start in on some DSM stuff here. So
Let's
if
do it.
someone asks you to explain what the DSM is, but let's say you could use no clinical language to do so, how would you describe it?
It is the book of last resort. It is when all of our other explanations about what may be going on for a person who is having trouble, when all of the other explanations we have in our various practices, medical practice, neurology, etc., when all of those kind of run out of answers, the DSM is the one you open. It, describes human struggles and various ways those struggles can affect a person's life.
I love that response and have, the book of last resort. Again, not what I would be expecting an expert on the DSM to say. Very refreshing in a lot of ways. All right, let me ask you this. Often, I hear this sort of in a colloquial sense all the time out in the world when I'm around colleagues, academics, whatever. They call the DSM the Bible of psychiatry, psychology, etc. What do you think about that metaphor, and do you actually see that as a helpful comparison?
I think it's a risk, right? I mean, I think it is a belief system. It is, creates a common language, much like, kind of guiding or religious texts do, but it's not religion, right? It is, let me think for a second here. That's the risk is that, and I'm going to use a big word here, that it gets reified, right? I read that a lot. That and reification means that it gets put on this pedestal, that it gets treated as an absolute truth, and you can see over the course of the DSM that the committees themselves that well apparently truth changes over time. That things were defined and this was a thing, right? If it's in the DSM, it's a thing now, and it can be used for, justification of medication, justification of payment, justification of legal decisions, etc. But then all of a sudden, diagnoses get removed. And did it ever exist? Was it just a mistake? We see that with like Asperger's. Sure, may, a lot may have got subsumed under the rewriting of autism spectrum disorder, but a lot didn't. So what does that mean about that? It's really social construction when it comes down to it. That society, we construct reality, right? And at least that's my perspective, right? Not everybody has social construction as a paradigm, but I think the DSM kind of does. There's a sentence in the DSM where they refer to the book itself as a historically determined cognitive schema. And I was just teaching this the other day, so it's fresh in my head. It's not like I carry around. Well, maybe I do carry around DSM quotes in my head because I've just done it so much. But a historically determined cognitive schema, which what is that, right? And they do this in a sentence where they say it's a historically determined cognitive schema designed to, and I'm paraphrasing, to enhance clarity and understanding. And I'm always like, well, cool. But that whole phrase, historically determined cognitive schema, is not very simple or understandable. But what does that mean? A cognitive schema meaning a way we organize ideas, a way we organize types. And we have a schema for like dogs, right? So I can show you a 150-pound Great Dane and a 3-pound Pomeranian, and yeah, dogs. They're both dogs. That's our cognitive schema. And we can say, well, it's canines and we have genetic. Okay, fine. It's still a cognitive schema. It's still a way we've organized the world that this is one type of animal. And if you were to show that to some extraterrestrial and these two dogs, be like, yeah, they're both the same animal. They would be like, what are you talking about? So cognitive schemas are the way both individually we have cognitive schemas and then we have societal cognitive schemas. And so historically determined. Well, what was the history, right? Who was in power? Who got to decide what went in the book and what didn't? And how has that changed over time? And the story of DSM from Dr. Robert Spitzer up to now all of these committees and the debates in the background, that is the historical determination that power determines reality, which is a Foucault quote.
Okay, now you're speaking my language, quoting Foucault. Again, you're
Yeah.
surprising me around every turn. It's not something I would expect in this, something I would expect in someone who was like anti DSM to be quoting Foucault. Now, you've already mentioned two things of real interest to me. One, that the DSM is essentially a belief system, and two, that power helps shape it. I mean, what I hear you saying is what I hear a lot of the critics of the DSM saying, and I want to understand how you can take in those critiques and also use the DSM to good effect in your own work.
Right. I mean, I don't think anything is just one thing. Right. That's it again goes back to my experience kind of Grateful Dead world of nothing is just one thing. There's multiple facets. And any item can be used to build up. That same item can also be used to destruct. And you see that with the DSM, right? If it's used appropriately, it provides people insight and a sense of community almost, right? Like, oh, I have now there's a name for this that I'm going through, and I can find other people who have experienced similar things, and it allows for communication of research that we're using a common language that I know if colleagues in Australia are publishing on major depressive disorder and effective treatments that is very similar to what I'm talking about when I talk about major depressive disorder, right? It certainly can be used in a flippant manner or in a pathologizing insulting manner for folks, and all of that. And I struggled with this myself when I got asked to teach DSM. One, I was surprised because I've always kind of talked just off the cuff and without many editings in my head. And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. We'll see how long I last. And it lasted for well over a decade until I decided it wasn't worth the money anymore. The pay was bad, being an adjunct professor. So the other end of it was, moving to doing therapy, doing consultations, doing active writing of support plans. That diagnosis is the first step on a never ending journey, right? That the real work happens afterwards. What is the purpose of using it here? One, are we trying to get our head around what's going on with this person and just have some starting point? Or two, we need to do it to bill, right? In the US healthcare system, you can't get a whole bunch of sessions of therapy without a diagnosis being attached. And so if we're going to do it, let's do it right. And if my voice helped other folks feel like they were, practicing ethically or with kind of that back and forth thinking, then good.
May I ask you more about power? What role do you think power plays in deciding, what gets included in the DSM, what gets removed or excluded or redefined?
So it's that again, that phrase, historically determined cognitive schema. So who determines history? Whose voice gets published? So I guess you can take it back to, somehow Freud having a voice that got listened to, popularized, and all that language, even though those ideas weren't entirely original, right? They themselves have a storyline going back to Greek history, right? Philosophy, the Platonic dyad, the Socratic method, looking a lot like therapy. And it is kind of a story of dominant culture, that there are many other explanatory or descriptive languages for these events, again, that we struggle to define, hearing voices or disruptions, significant disruptions of mood or thinking. So, those voices were empowered. They're the ones that were listened to, and I'll own it. Like, I'm part of that lineage, right? Here I am. I'm like a bald middle-aged white guy with a beard, right? It is like super stereotypical. So those powers, then you see it in the DSM. It was one person. Robert Spitzer wrote DSM-1, kind of decided to. And it, coming out of Emil Kraepelin in the 1800s, like this nosology, how do we name things? And started to parse it out. And DSM-1 had a very psychodynamic slant, and it was pretty rigid. And it was one person who did that. And then it grew from that. And now there's committees. And then there's all this debate about the openness of the DSM-5 process, with some former chairs of DSM-5 being pretty critical, or chair of DSM-4 being pretty critical of how DSM-5 went down. So there are many other voices out there, like in feminist psychology and in marginalized or minority studies, et cetera, disability studies, indigenous thinking on what is mental health, what is mental wellness, that they're out there. They're absolutely just as important, but not as reified, not as listened to.
Yeah, and the fact they're not as reified. Do you think the DSM needs to do a better job of incorporating some of these perspectives, or maybe it's helpful to have these perspectives exist separately as alternative perspectives as we're making sense of distress in the world? Like, what do we do with the fact that some ideas, and we don't control this, right? I mean, this happens culturally, historically, as you're saying. Some ideas get raised up and they get pushed forward. They made to feel like their truth, which is how the DSM can sometimes feel. And then also there are alternative ways of understanding distress that don't seem to get as much run. What do we do to honor those alternative ways of understanding distress?
I think DSM's attempted to address that, right? We see the cultural formulation, the cultural considerations, making their way into DSM-5 and 5TR with a real focus on the racialization and biased language that has occurred in previous editions and acknowledging that, trying to improve it. That made me feel like, okay, there's, that's it's not the end of the journey though. That hopefully that type of endeavor continues to have a wider swath of voices involved in this. We here in New Mexico, it's such a big state and so kind of empty and sparsely populated with this amazing diversity of language and thought and practice and community. Because my work for a long time has been statewide, I know, going into the Dene community, the Navajo Nation, that I'm entering their world, right? That I'm the one who needs to learn, and seeing the way the families in that community have walked both sides, right? Walking that, like, hey, we're going to engage with this Department of Health guy, but he's going to engage with us, and learning a lot about how, there are many roads to the same destination of somebody feeling better or not feeling so alone.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing, and tell me if this misses the mark, is a collaboration then. Like it's where both parties are contributing something. It's not where, psychology and psychiatry sort of dictate how we define distress. I think what you're describing is more of a collaboration. There's a reciprocity, I think I'm hearing.
Right, yeah, reciprocity, and in therapy, I've found that too, and in work with folks with disabilities, that person's voice needs to be primary. I think we hear it talked about as like trauma-informed practice now, trauma-informed care, and that's become quite a prevalent phrase, which talks about collaboration and mutuality and a person's voice and trustworthiness and safety. And I was talking about this with a buddy of mine I've worked with for a long time, Jim Hoven, who has been a real amazing teacher of mine. And we're trying to integrate trauma informed language into the plans that we write and recommendations we give. And he's like, you know what, Buckles? I've been doing this a long time. And back in the 80s, we were doing the same thing and we don't have any fancy term for it. We just called it being a good goddamn person. Um, that you listen to the person you're working with, you're letting them talk instead of talking over them. I was like, yeah, I love Jim. He often, gives me a little smack of when I'm getting too jargony.
So, well, you've been talking, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, this idea that, perhaps pathologizing can happen as a part of this document that we call the DSM. And I think one of the concerns that a lot of folks have is that somehow normal human suffering is becoming pathologized. And so, what's a diagnosis and just, a difficult season of life for someone?
I get real concerned about that. And we see it right now in DSM-5 where there's a new diagnosis. I think of diagnosis and psychiatric diagnoses as like, metaphorically, let's imagine like we've got a big pie, right? And let's say that pie contains all of the psychiatric diagnoses. And we used to just slice it in two. We'd have psychosis and neurosis, right? That, like, two kind of diagnoses. And that slice line was kind of like borderline. That's where almost that term comes from, the borderline between psychosis and neurosis. And we say, well, we keep just slicing it finer. Every time we add something to DSM, it's not adding something, it's slicing this slice a little finer, making it better defined. And certainly that does happen. But now we've got this new diagnosis of persistent bereavement disorder. And that is fairly controversial. Now, I'm not certainly not debating that sometimes the length and intensity of bereavement is beyond what maybe we expect within our particular community of how people bereave, and people need access to mental health support. Does that mean it's a disorder? Though, I mean, and that word disorder comes up in every diagnosis. And to kind of sideline on that would be post-traumatic stress. Is that a disorder? And I kind of, in my teaching practice and in my, like when I'm training direct support staff or talking to families or talking to a person who's experiencing that kind of cluster of symptoms, I say, we're going to call this post-traumatic stress injury, that you were injured, that the disorder is what happened to you. The disorder was the event. That event was disordered. If you weren't having nightmares and bad memories and emotional kind of numbing and all of that other cluster, that would be odd. And there was a lot of voices from the veterans community saying, "Can you stop calling it a disorder? I'm hurt. I'm not disordered. Please just treat my injury." And that really, really spoke to me. And I think hopefully I've seen direct support staff working with folks who've been really traumatized. The level of trauma encountered by folks with intellectual disability, developmental disability is at like 4 times the rate in the general population. And so we have a lot of direct support staff, young men and women who are out there every day, 24 hours a day, supporting people's lives. And you'd get the question, well, God, what is wrong with this person? And we say, no, the question is what happened to this person? And then the actual question is, what's going to happen next? What's the next chapter of this story? What's the next word that we're going to write in their book? What's the next sentence? What's the next paragraph? And how do we make it a story where trauma doesn't happen again? So that, post traumatic stress disorder being, I get it, it's in the DSM. Is it a mental disorder or is it like pretty much like you're hurt? This is the symptoms of an injury. And to me, that's a better perspective. It helps me at least be more clear about what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're drawing this distinction, I think, between disordered people and disordered events or happenings, right?
Mhm.
And I've often wondered what it would be like, just as sort of a social experiment, if we came up with a DSM to diagnose the culture and the systems at large, as opposed to the people. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Sometimes disability is the result of a disabling environment, a mismatch between a person's needs and what's available. That again is goes back to some social construction thought of a person has a condition, right? We can agree on the condition of, say, like myopia, of nearsightedness. We do the test. Yep, myopia. Is myopia a disability? Well, that depends, right? What time in history do you live? Do you have access to glasses? Do you have the money to get them? Do you have the money to have 2 pairs of glasses? And we do this in class, like who's nearsighted, and I would say, "Are you disabled?" And the person would say, "No." And I'd say, "No, take off your glasses. Are you disabled?" And they say, "Yeah, I could not drive right now. I would need a lot more support." And how disability is kind of a moving target and how maybe disorder can be a moving target as well, depending on one's kind of, access to social power, right? Being able to drive and go get glasses and pay for them is social power. I've done a lot of work with folks living on the streets who, that would be impossible. So they're living their lives not being able to see 10 feet in front of them and can't just walk into whatever optical shop and get glasses, right? So does that mean that it's their problem, that something's wrong with them? Access to mental health care, access to health insurance, access to Medicaid programs, that definitely I've seen folks that we have worked with that have gotten better, not because we're some magicians, but we were part of the story and they had access to medication, they had access, and when something didn't go right, when something got denied, they knew they could call their insurance company and be like, "Nope, let me talk to the next person. Let me talk to the next person," until it got approved. So that equation, does a condition become more or less disabling, depends on all of these mitigating factors in between.
Okay, so something I've noticed, it sounds like I've been teaching for about the same amount of time as you have around, for me, and maybe a little less, about 18 years. Now, was it 2025? Yeah, about 18 years. And I've taught quote unquote abnormal psych classes, which as time went on, I started putting quotes around the abnormal for reasons I think you'd understand. One thing I've noticed that shifted over time with the students in my classes is that the jargon of the DSM, they know, like, for example, in 2008, I rarely heard a student use the phrase narcissistic or narcissism. Like that almost never
Right.
came up. And in fact, when we would cover the personality disorders in the DSM, people, they'd be like, "What does this even mean? Narcissism, this weird word." And now people are using it's not only narcissism, but that one's around a bunch, right? Everyone's narcissistic, or what to do with a narcissist if you're in a
Right.
relationship with them. And, you know, this is on TikTok, it's on social media, it's everywhere. And on one hand, I think to myself, well, it's interesting that we have people, and probably disproportionately young people, not exclusively young people, but disproportionately young people, talking about these things and aware of mental health. And so I can see the benefits of that. I also worry about how this language has become so commonplace and people are adopting it so quickly. I mean, what do you think the effects of this might be? And is this empowering, or is it actually limiting in some way?
Again, it's probably both, right? Nothing is just one thing. I love that there is a disruption of the stigma around mental health and people, because I can recall in the 1980s, 90s that it was like hush hush, right? You'd say it in whispered tones, and it was an "oh, you poor thing," there, but for the grace of God go I kind of idea. And we still really do see with intellectual disability that remains in that boat. But I love that people are feeling free to talk about these things. I think that itself can be therapeutic if it is for that person. For some people, it's not. But it's like being watered down, right? It's losing some of its meaning. Like I hear folks say, "Oh my God, I'm so manic today." And I'm like, "No, you're not." Um, that has a specific meaning. And once you see somebody who is experiencing a manic episode, a full spectrum manic episode, you will never use that word in the same way again. That is a very specific, very dangerous and concerning event. Or you see it with OCD. Oh, I'm so OCD. And it can take away some of the legitimacy, I think, of the diagnosis, that for all its faults and foibles, that is our tool. And I guess I get a little protective of it. Like, do you even know what that word means? Like, let's talk about it. Because you're going through something, but it's not that, you know? Um, you have a lot of energy and you drank a little bit too much coffee today does not mean you're like manic.
I wonder about that with the word trauma. I feel like in the last decade or so, I mean, it seems like almost everything that is distressful is being categorized. I don't always mean by clinicians, right? But people out in the world
Right.
as trauma. And I think I can see how that came to be, because there was a point in time where if something was traumatic and it got labeled as such, it was taken seriously. So I think people came in saying, like, look, this was traumatic for me. This was trauma. Oh, I have PTSD, even if they weren't certain what that meant, because they really wanted their distress to be taken seriously. I do worry now we've gotten to a point, though, if everything's trauma, is anything trauma?
So, I'll counter that a little bit. There was the debate in some parts of the literature going into DSM-5 of qualifying trauma, right? Because that's kind of the first bullet in the diagnosis is person has experienced a traumatic event that of a certain nature, and the debate was, are we going to keep it? Should we keep it as the big T trauma? Or are we going to be widen it out to include what might be referred to as small T traumas? So big T trauma, like threat to life or limb, witnessing that in someone else, a serious accident, encountering major aggression, fire, flood, other natural disaster, battle, war, conflict. I'm sure there's others that fit under that umbrella. And then small T trauma being the other stuff that people say that's traumatic to me. That was a trauma. And I have learned heavily throughout the years of working with folks with intellectual disability that, yeah, little events that I may not consider a trauma have been intensely traumatic for that person. And I am not going to get into the business of telling somebody that that wasn't a trauma. I feel like that's a really personal disclosure for that person. And to debate it, I don't know, does any service for that person. It's more like, okay, that's fine. So let's get into it. And then also recognizing all of the traumas people won't talk about, that maybe talking about these little things, they don't want to tell you about the big stuff. It still happens now. I am wary ever when I walk into like a new place to play pool or something like that or hang out. People, oh, what do you do? And if I say I'm a psychologist or I work in psychology, then oh my goodness, within 5 minutes, I'm hearing some really wicked things, or small stuff. Oh, I got to tell you about this, and I'm like, no, you don't. I'm off duty. Um, but I'm still kind and I listen because that's the nature of me. And so anyway, I'm getting a little bit sideways on that. I again, maybe the issue is the experience of trauma, a mental disorder, is to me where it's a more salient debate. And I was a proponent. I wish they had widened the definition. We see that in kind of an alternative diagnostic book, the DMID, the Diagnostic Manual Intellectual Disability, which is a corollary to the DSM. It's a valid instrument for helping to determine kind of psychiatric categories of diagnosis for somebody who may be nonverbal or have less verbal ability or cognitive differences, etc. And so in that book, they did widen the qualifying event portion of it because it was highly necessary for our population because we were seeing folks who wouldn't qualify for the DSM diagnosis because they couldn't speak about their internal world, right? It's real bias in DSM that you have to be pretty fluent in talking about your internal world. And a lot of the folks I support in my day-to-day work aren't for whatever reason, neurologically or genetically or something like that. And so it was to see DMID widen that was a relief to us. It allowed us to then validly diagnose a person, and which then allowed them to get access to treatment.
Yeah, what do you think about, because to me, it's interesting. It seems like we're debating, do we, not just you and I, but the field has been for some time, do we widen the definition? Do we make it more narrow? And in my work as a clinician, I often find that using the person's words is more useful than anything. And sometimes that language of trauma, it's almost like then people are competing to have what their experience like meet the definition of trauma. Whereas more often I'm interested in that experience and understanding how the person makes sense of it and what they might call that experience.
Exactly, right, because again, the use of DSM, it's necessary, it is the for all the tools we have, it's the most widely used, but it that the work is has only just begun once you kind of write down whatever the code is. If we're working as, psychologists, mental health professionals, social workers, etc., the real work is the next, 100 sessions or whatever it may be. If that use of DSM allows somebody to get access to treatment, then good. I remember I wrote a chapter a few years back on the epidemiology or prevalence of mental health conditions for people with intellectual disability, kind of like a review of the research. And I had a couple publications on it, and then I got invited to write a chapter. And so I'm working with folks out of the UK, Nick Boris and Colin Hemmings, and so we're going back and forth on the phone and text and emails. And so, because I had written a paragraph about diagnostic inflation, why might we see increased prevalence? And the reasons behind that. And one subpart of that was like upcoding, right? Where, oh, this person doesn't quite meet the definition in the DSM, but I'm going to upcode it to get their insurance to pay for it. It's not ethical, right? But we know it happens. And they were dumbfounded. They were like, "Why would you have to do that?" In a British accent, they said that to me. And I explained, "Well, you can't get really, qualification or allowance for ongoing mental health counseling in the US through your insurance unless you have a diagnosis. There's no such thing as like quote unquote well person mental health care unless you're paying out of pocket. And that can be quite expensive, obviously, and a privilege. And they were like, Wait, I had to explain it like 3 times. And they said, so sometimes you need to just diagnose just to get paid. And I said, yeah, yeah. And the hallmark one that I think probably occurs most is adjustment disorder, right? It is, adjustment disorder. You're having a hard time with your job and it's making you anxious and stressed out and you can't sleep and it's kind of worse than you thought it would be. Oh, that's a psychiatric diagnosis. And we got finger wagged by an insurance company at one point. This was years and years ago. They said, you all are diagnosing adjustment disorder too much. It's beyond the expected rate. And we were like, look at our charts. It's justified. We maybe word got around and everybody with an adjustment disorder is coming to see us. Um,
I love that story. I had a similar story when I was early in my career. This was probably like 2003. I was a master's student doing my external practicum in South Los Angeles, and I was some of my work I was subcontracted by the county. And after about 6 months, they said, Travis, like 90% of your diagnoses are adjustment disorder. And
Yeah.
I said, hmm? And I said, well, you can't do that. And I was like, well, are you asking me to be fraudulent in how I'm reporting this? I mean, these are folks that meet the criteria for this. Now, of course, I knew what I was doing in the sense that they didn't qualify for any of these other there were like 5 or 6 diagnoses that we were supposed to be using. But, like adjustment disorder is where 90+% of people fell. And so in one way, it was great because it was a non-pathologizing way of doing this. Another way I thought, not so much at the time, but, certainly years later, I was like, this is silly. Like, why are we going through this to justify care for people? And it makes me wonder, what do you like? Would the DSM exist now if we didn't have to use it to justify people getting care within the system? Would it exist but just differently? Like, what do you think it would look like if it
Right.
wasn't so tethered to the system?
It is that's a really interesting I would direct folks, it's pretty nerdy book, but it's called Creating Mental Illness by Horvitz, I believe. Mark Horvitz, maybe? But Creating Mental Illness, and it talks exactly about that, the interplay between the rise of managed care and the building of the DSM. Specifically, for mental health aspects of managed care, and then the other book by Greenberg is the Book of Woe. Both of those kind of connect some dots on those. Horvitz, the Creating Mental Illness, is really, really quite a deep dive into it. I think there's definitely some aspects of it that's true. Would DSM have risen to such prominence? But at the same time, we see in other parts of the world where they don't deal with a managed care system and the gatekeeping on mental health care, where you can just walk in and see somebody and not have to be diagnosed, that they also use DSM, right? That it has a usability. Again, that creates a common language. It allows us to kind of shorthand at points, as long as we're shorthanding carefully, because that's part of that pathologizing conversation we left off, was when it's used as a shorthand to label somebody, that can be real damaging. But right, so we see DSM used kind of globally. In the United States, definitely there has been a because anytime a diagnosis gets added to DSM, you have to think there's discussions in the insurance world of saying, "Oh my goodness, we have to pay for this now." Like complex persistent bereavement disorder, which used to be like prolonged grief, was like a diagnosis for further study, for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, for autism, etc., where the push, and then the mental health parity that came about as part of the Affordable Care Act. Definitively, you have to think there are discussions at the insurance companies of, oh, great, here we go. How much are we going to have to pay out for this? And now we have to pay for people who are sad because they lost a loved one. And maybe I'm being a little flip about that. I'm sure there are people who are very caring at managed care organizations.
I'm sure. Yeah, I don't blame the individual people, but it
Right.
does seem like these systems are deeply entangled with, late capitalist ideals and so forth. And it just makes me wonder how these systems of diagnoses might look different, if
Right.
they weren't so tethered to late capitalism. So let me ask you this really quick. You you're in charge of chairing DSM-6. What would you want it to look like? What would be some of your most important initiatives? What would you want to be different? What would you want to keep the same?
So that's pretty interesting. I would at least have like kind of an appendix where I remember what was that old one? The defensive functioning scale. I always thought that was a pretty cool part of DSM-4, where it was like ways people defended themselves from mental distress. And it was like kind of went in a hierarchy from like kind of, maybe they called it like immature, or some of the language was not, this was like fantasizing or universality or projection, like all that type of stuff. I thought that was cool, but I would add a different appendix where we start to say, can we start to have some look at how do we diagnose human resilience? How do you diagnose human survival? Like all of the folks that we work with, and myself included, were survivors. How did we do it? uh, what were what were the tools we used? Even if some of those tools may not, sometimes they become not functional, right? Like sometimes we withdraw, sometimes we dissociate. But at those times, it was necessary, it was useful, and here I am. I'm still alive. It must have worked in some way. Because I see this in my work where we get kind of the diagnostic dog pile on some folks with intellectual disability where it's just like, my goodness, like who's managing this? Like you cannot have both schizoaffective and bipolar at the same time. They're like, who is doing this? And then it would be 10 other diagnoses. And it that can become very you feel hopeless, if you're a parent or direct support staff, saying, well, then what are we supposed to do? And so in our plans and in the way we've tried to work on building this system is the behavior support consultant or therapist that's working with that person. We have tried to integrate a section on what are the diagnoses of resilience for this person? How did they survive all the things they've been through? What are their strengths? And I'd love to see kind of an experiment on that in DSM-6 that says, how do we diagnose mental health instead of mental disorder?
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Like, part of what I hear you saying is, how do we measure how people are responding and not just what it is that they've been up against?
Correct. Mhm.
And I think as therapists, I mean, there are exceptions. I could imagine in working with intellectual disabilities, for example, this might be an exception, but for so much of what I think your average clinician is working with, the diagnosis isn't, I mean, look, therapy doesn't always work quite like medicine, right? It's not like you get the diagnosis and it reveals some sort of prescriptive treatment plan, you know? And so I think so much of what we're up against as clinicians is often how people are responding, not just what they're up against. Of course, it's helpful to know what they're up against, but sometimes you can have that label. And if you don't know how people are responding, and how they prefer to respond and what might be, what might serve them best in terms of their response. As a clinician, the label itself may not always be that helpful.
Right, and it can get in the way sometimes too of seeing the person, right? There's a quote from it's an older article, like from 2001 or something, Malloy and Vassal, The Social Construction of Asperger's disorder, which has a beautiful quote in the beginning where once the diagnostic label is attached, so we attach it, I'm kind of holding my hand up in front of my face, but we run the risk of seeing everything the person shows us as a symptom rather than maybe as a response to problems, or the problematic expectations of the social environment, I think is how they put it. That label, that oversimplification that a person is so much more than their diagnosis, right? And for some reason, mental health diagnoses get used almost like a person's name after they're applied. And I think we see this a lot with personality disorders. But we also see it with like schizophrenia, and then we see it in the popular media, right? Where somebody robs a bank or something, and the headline may read like "schizophrenic man robs a bank." And then what does that do? Well, then for in the general world, it would be like, oh, well, people with schizophrenia are dangerous. The schizophrenia is why he robbed the bank. We never hear like diabetic woman robs a bank, even though I'm sure a woman with diabetes at some point has robbed a bank. And maybe as a result of some symptoms she was encountering from the diabetes, like maybe a hyperglycemic episode where, a person's dissociated and can look pretty delusional. But the mental health aspect of somebody has a diagnosis, it's used as this explanatory mechanism for everything they do. And I've worked with hundreds of people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and mostly what I would say is they're marginalized, they're lonely, they're separated. And that would be a much more useful headline of marginalized person robbed a bank, desperate person, because that's the actual etiology of how somebody gets to that point in their life.
Yeah. Oh, I really resonate with that. All right, I couldn't let you go without bringing this up. You brought it up a little bit in your last response, and I want to talk just quickly before we wrap up about personality disorders because
Okay.
I feel like these are, yeah, I'm going to throw this at you, Jason, on the last 5 minutes. You're welcome.
Yeah,
And
it's like the last 5 minutes of a therapy session. Like, here's how about this?
I'm going to drop the bomb on you. Well, see, what I'm going to do is actually set it up so that you can say enough that it forces you to have to come back and do another episode just
I
on
I
person.
would dig that.
But I do feel like personality disorders are controversial, maybe as controversial as any of the labels in the big book of diagnoses. And I'll share a quick story from when I was in grad school. I had a well-intentioned mentor of mine, and just so people know, a very compassionate person. You got to understand the context in which this was coming from. It was looking out for me, really. So he said this in a very compassionate way. But he said, Travis, make sure that you never have more than two or three borderlines on your caseload at any one time. And again, this wasn't something that in the moment I understood completely, but I've come to think of it over the years. Obviously, I'm still talking about it now, 20 years later with you, but it's sort of like, gosh, these stories that we tell about these labels are really powerful. And there's stories there with borderline in particular that, hey, these folks are so much that you can't work with more than two or three of them, right? They could cause problems to your caseload. And again, that came from a compassionate place, but the story, I mean, it's so all encompassing about what these personality disorders are. And to say that someone's personality is disordered, I mean, that's one hell of a claim to make. So you can probably see more of the side that I'm on, but I'm curious what you make of personality disorders and the sort of controversy that exists there.
So I got a couple stories. One goes to Dr. Kenneth Wells, who I spoke about earlier, who is the founder and just such an amazing clinical director at Counseling and Psychotherapy Institute. He was from Laguna Pueblo, and raised in a very indigenous way of that Pueblo, and really spoke to his humanity and how he ran that clinic. I remember him throwing the DSM at me one day because how compassionate it was out of kindness, and he was like, "Will you get that shit out of your mouth, Buckles?" He was like, "They're a person, not a diagnosis." And it was about borderline at that point. And our rule at that clinic, that he was pretty iron fisted about, is there is no way in hell he would allow you to diagnose a personality disorder after meeting somebody for an hour.
Mm.
He said the minimum is you have got to work with them for a year before we would even consider that. And even then, and this is a classic Ken quote that I have up on many slides when I do trainings, according to DSM, just having a personality is a disorder. And so that really informed me. But then also, I remember at another clinic, we jumped out and we ran our own little co-op for a while. And we had like a whiteboard in the kitchen. It was like, what do we need? As the question, if we needed, supplies or whatever. And my buddy Rob had written on there a rich axis to. And axis 2 was like the old place in the axes, multi-axial format where you'd put axis 2 disorders, like all the personality disorders. And then I think like intellectual disability would get put on there. And he was saying it as a joke, right? But that's like the bias, the stigma of, oh, axis 2 folks are really untreatable. And it is, uh, and that same thing, oh, you don't want to have too many. In my work, with folks with ID, there's so little research on it that, and anytime I've seen somebody diagnosed or have that label of bipolar or borderline personality disorder, when we unfold everything, when we unwrap that tangled life the person has led, it comes back to major trauma. That, like, to me, when I see borderline personality disorder written down, I immediately think complex post-traumatic stress, the instability of relationships, the being scared of getting close, the but wanting to be close, all of that. And so I have a healthy sense of skepticism when I read that diagnosis. But then sometimes you see it, right? Sometimes you're like, oh, right, you've proved it to me. I relent. Like the guy we had at Counseling and Psychotherapy Institute, who I kept saying, this is histrionic. Like, he's checking every box, and he'd been there for a year. And I'm like, this is histrionic. Maybe it has a trauma origin. Maybe this is his expression of trauma, but the best fit for, because we're, it sometimes can help to have that diagnostic framework where you're like, this gives us some foothold or different things to read. And he finally proved it out when he had this massive seizure, quote unquote seizure, in our waiting room, foaming at the mouth, all that. And Ken was there, and Ken was like, step away, everybody. Just let him get it out of his system. And about 5 minutes later, and he played it out. He just got up and he said, "Fine, screw you guys," and flipped us off and walked out. And I said, "See, histrionic." um, to Ken, he was like, "All right, you can put it in the damn chart." So, all of that being said, I always say almost the same thing you did. Of you're saying somebody's whole personality is disordered, like that's quite intense. And it is this weird little section of the DSM that has almost this entirely different paradigm behind it of personality psychology. And I know the updates and reorganizing of that. I kind of zoned out trying to read it. I was like, I don't even know what this is talking about at this point, and kind of passively resisted getting too deep into it.
Dr. Jason Buckles, this was amazing. What I was really hoping for in this conversation was to have sort of nuanced, contextualized, and also hopefully accessible conversation. And I feel like all of that happened. And around this particular topic, I don't feel like that's guaranteed. I mean, I've experienced so much polarization with this, people rooted in their beliefs so firmly. And I appreciate your flexibility. I appreciate your wisdom over 2 decades in working with us. And I appreciate your honesty. So thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate just being able to chat about it. Not have it like structured out. Like just to have a talk about this is important. And yeah, pleasure was mine. Thank you.